Serhiy Burchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, is joining us. Hello, Serhiy.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to our heroes and defense forces. Greetings, colleagues.
Serhiy, what are your thoughts regarding the new attempts by the Russian army to invade the territory of Kharkiv region, their attempts to capture it? So far, we're seeing a tactic of infiltration, but still, with what kind of forces are they trying to do this? And actually, what are the main goals besides expanding the buffer zone? Still, I guess it all depends on what kind of forces they're using. Everything important you need to know today is already in the Freedom app. Live broadcasts, special projects, reports, and analysis. Just download the app from the App Store or Play Market and get up-to-date information wherever you are. Staying informed about important events with Freedom is easy.
Well, basically, the Ukrainian border area near the state border with the Russian Federation, we can see that this is the tactic of the Russian occupiers. Attempts by sabotage and reconnaissance groups, small infantry groups to infiltrate those settlements that are close to the border. And accordingly, very often these settlements have already been abandoned by local residents. So they try to integrate into our combat formations, including that, although they haven't been able to do it. Drones, as they say, are on alert and destroy all moving Russian targets. Well, basically, there is certain attempts at build-up. As of today, I see it this way. The creation of those gray zones that the Russian occupiers talk about is indeed one of their priorities on the battlefield. However, it really is worth mentioning their resources. Today, the resources available on these sections of the front, not just in the Kharkiv region, by the way, don't allow the Russians to launch a full-scale offensive there. We can see what's happening, especially in the southern operational zone or on the eastern Donetsk front. That's why today, attempts to create these kinds of movements, these hotspots of tension along our border, are happening constantly. But again, there simply aren't enough resources for a larger scale offensive right now. However, they are also trying to probe our combat formations, so that kind of work is going on as well. But so far, the Russians haven't succeeded at anything, even though creating a buffer zone remains a priority for them. On the other hand, we also understand perfectly well that today our defense forces, I believe, are capable of carrying out missions today, tomorrow, or in the near future that will already be connected to the Russian border areas. And this also includes our sanitary zones, buffer zones, so that the Russians don't cross the Russian-Ukrainian state border at all. And accordingly, so we can secure these sections of the front. And of course, another goal for the Russians is to divert our resources, potential resources that should be directed to other parts of the front. There are fiercer battles happening there. As I already mentioned, that's the Zaporizhia front in particular, as well as the Donetsk front.
Today, the acting Minister of Defense, Yevhen Komaro, met with Commander-in-Chief Drafapati, and the key focus areas for the Ukrainian Defense Forces right now have been defined as long-range strikes on Russia, deep strike, middle strike, in short, bringing the war onto the territory of the Russian Federation. What can you say about this kind of strategy, and in general about the personnel decisions?
Well, basically, this is a continuation of the topic we've just been discussing. It's about creating buffer sanitary zones and indeed shifting military actions, actual warfare, onto the territory of the Russian Federation. Today, our strikes are in the middle strike range and they're being carried out, including on temporarily occupied territories. As for the Russian regions themselves, here we see strikes using longer range firepower, in particular our well-known Luti UAVs, which cover unbelievable distances and inflict this kind of damage on the enemy. Today, there was a good fire in Bashkortostan. We know that everything related to petroleum products there will keep burning in the future. And accordingly, this undermines the economic arguments of the Russian Federation to continue the war. So naturally, it affects Russian resources. Today, we are not just defining such a strategy, we are sticking to it because the defense forces obviously understand very well that the so-called full mobilization announced by the Russian authorities is quite likely. And today, the numbers being mentioned, the contingent of 500,000 occupiers, it's quite possible that the Russians are counting on that. Because let me remind you, the total number of the occupying corps in our country today is over 700,000. So we understand just how serious such a possible, emphasizing possible, reinforcement of the Russian occupation forces would be. Accordingly, these troops must not reach the front line. Accordingly, these strikes that will be carried out at long distances will also target training grounds where such fighters might be prepared. They will target permanent deployment points as well. I think that our relevant defense structures, which carry out such long range strikes, will also focus their attention on this. And in fact, the logistics that would prevent the occupiers from being brought directly to the front line. All of this will be destroyed, either at stationary locations or on the move, but it must be destroyed so that the situation on the battlefield does not change. And here's another very important point that the new commander-in-chief talks about, and we know this is a characteristic trait of our new head of the armed forces of Ukraine, General Drapatayi. It's to protect the personnel as much as possible. We understand perfectly well that, unfortunately, we don't have the same mobilization resources as the Russians do. But on the other hand, preserving the soldiers so that this soldier can destroy more Russian occupiers, this approach, of course, like new technologies, helps us and will help us in this confrontation.
How to counter, to withstand certain challenges. The Security Service of Ukraine has identified 6 more cases where Russia used depleted uranium munitions during attacks on the Chernihiv region. According to the investigation, hazardous components were found in Geran 2 attack drones, which Russian forces used to attack the region from April to June of this year. The gamma radiation level of some fragments exceeds the norm by 80 times and poses a threat to human health and the environment. Let's listen and continue.
The enemy is using radioactive elements in ER-60M missiles, which they've adapted for use on their UAVs. During the inspection of the sites hit by Russian drones, the investigative team and state emergency service specialists recorded radiation levels 80 times higher than normal. According to the results of an expert analysis initiated by the Security Service, it was established that the warheads of these missiles contain nuclear material identified as uranium-235 and uranium-238, reads the statement from the Security Service of Ukraine on the agency's website.
Sergei, how do you assess the main objectives behind the use of drones specifically? And actually, how do you deal with things like this? If there's such a huge excess, that could also fall under violations of the rules of war. What's your assessment?
Well, this is additional material for an international tribunal when we and the rest of the world will be prosecuting the war criminals of the Russian Federation. Accordingly, these ER-60M missiles are being used with these new technologies, these new UAVs. These are Soviet-era missiles that really did use such radioactive elements. We see that Russia not only fails to follow the rules of warfare, but today Russia cynically violates any agreements and conventions. Russia deliberately uses such missiles to increase their impact on personnel and on our equipment, which they target with such firepower accordingly. So we see that on the one hand, this shows that Russia, as they say, is using everything it has today. And on the other hand, it may indicate that there's a certain shortage of some modern means of firepower. That's why Russia is forced to use, among other things, some Soviet stockpiles, Soviet arsenals. And accordingly, such strikes are being carried out. This is not the first case, far from the first, that has been noted by both our Security Service of Ukraine and, accordingly, by employees of the Ministry of Emergency Situations. On the other hand, we must clearly understand that there's only one way to fight this evil, and it's very simple. Destroy all of it as it approaches. And we see today that Ukraine is developing new technologies and is forced to do this very quickly because the same shelling, for example, of southern Ukraine doesn't give us a chance to relax, doesn't give us the opportunity to spend time, thinking things over or creating something at a slower pace than what is being done today. We see, particularly in the South, the use of new technologies as well. This isn't an announcement, it's, well, let's say a bit of intrigue. This is what allows us today to at least reduce the consequences of those strikes, including those from Russian ballistic missiles on the south of our country and beyond. And I think our engineers will make certain breakthroughs in electronic warfare systems as well, which will also affect drones like these with such deadly missiles. Let me remind you, this is a Soviet-era missile, the ER-60M.
Recently, there was information that Russia is transferring troops through Mariupol, specifically toward the southern direction, disguising their convoys as civilian vehicles. Is there a way, so to speak, to track things like this? And overall, how does the Azov drone systems campaign affect the front as a whole? And in particular, yes, the southern direction, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the southern parts of Donetsk region.
So, as for the Azov Triangle or the Azov location, we're talking about Berdansk and Mariupol. Such strikes are constantly being carried out on various targets of the Russian Federation, Russian occupiers in this area, in this location. Today, perhaps our viewers see less evidence of the strikes that are happening on the well known Simferopol-Rostov highway. However, that doesn't mean that this work isn't being done. It's being carried out very actively, and you can see this in the reports from the general staff that you provide to our viewers every day. Maybe we've just gotten used to this routine, but very important work of the defense forces. This kind of work is happening all the time. I would also add the strikes on the energy infrastructure in the temporarily occupied territories, particularly in this location we're talking about. Well, actually, this is the temporarily occupied territory, part of Kherson region, Zaporizhia region, and of course, a Peninsula Crimea. And probably we should also add the temporarily occupied Ukrainian Kuban, Krasnodar Krai, Rostov region, and Stavropol Krai, because energy facilities are the foundation, including for the functioning of the local occupation authorities. And most importantly, this directly affects the operations of the Russian army, which is active here in the southern operational zone of the theater of military action. All of this has a direct impact. So such strikes will continue going forward. As stated by the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces drone systems, Mr. Brody Matter, these operations have no set end date, but their outcome is obvious for the Russian occupiers.
By the way, I wanted to clarify how the fuel crisis has affected the Russian military at the front. So, Verska has analyzed the situation with the Russian Federation's military. And while the Russian authorities are trying to solve fuel problems in the regions, these issues have already reached the front line, according to journalists. They are starting to introduce limits there and are reducing the supply of fuel and lubricants for military equipment. And all this information was gathered from complaints, so to speak, from Russian military personnel. How would you assess, or maybe you have information, where is the crisis situation the worst for them?
The thing is, these are the kinds of events that, of course, are bringing the Russian army closer to problems related to fuel and lubricants. Definitely. But again, for that to happen, it will take time, maybe even several weeks. If our strikes like these continue, specifically targeting fuel and lubricants and those oil depots located in various areas, then accordingly, the snowball of these problems will eventually reach the front lines directly. Because right now, there's still reserves. Not everything has been destroyed yet. Unfortunately, there are still reserves today, which, by the way, this is where logic comes in. It's becoming harder and harder to replenish them. And of course, right now, all civilians are working for the military. Civilians are facing huge problems, including with supplies of medicine and even food. Everything is still going to the occupying army for now. But again, this can't go on forever. The Defense Forces strikes are continuing. I think that, well, for at least several more months until the fall, maybe a bit longer, these problems will keep piling up. And to be honest, will really force the enemy to make major adjustments. Although today, the enemy, including on the front lines, if we go back directly to the theater of military operations, is trying to carry out mechanized attacks. Accordingly, maybe this isn't quite agony yet, but it's an attempt to use the time that's slipping away and the fuel and lubricants they still have to try to break through our defenses. Because after that, those same tanks won't be able to move at all. To back up what I'm saying, for example, the day before yesterday, we saw 2 tanks destroyed. This morning, according to the general staff reports, that's another 28. No details. Information blackout. We're sticking to that rule. All I can say is that in destroying this number of Russian tanks, units from the Pokrovska direction were involved. And as everyone knows, yes, those very same small groups really gave them a beating.
And in addition to the destroyed equipment, a Buk M3 surface to air missile system worth $50 million was destroyed by the Phoenix unit of the Ukrainian border guards in the Donetsk region. And that thing moves on something too. I'd also like to clarify one last thing about Kupiansk. Russian forces are unable to advance in the Kupiansk direction. This is stated in a new report by the Institute for the Study of War. According to analysts, the Russian army's offensive is being held back by the active work of Ukrainian drones, a lack of trained soldiers, and a fuel shortage. The Institute notes that due to a shortage of gasoline, Russian units are unable to actively use motorcycles, ATVs, and other vehicles. In addition, Ukrainian drone control of the skies prevents the enemy from using their own drones, including Lancets and Molnias. As they say, the fuel crisis is also largely a logistics issue. What would you add about the situation in Kupiansk?
Well, accordingly, if we're talking about the situation in Kupiansk, the enemy has stepped up their actions here as much as possible because the goal of occupying Kupiansk remains for the Russians. You remember how many times, probably lost count, just like I did, they've already occupied this settlement. But this remains their objective for the near future, so they definitely won't spare their personnel. If there's no gasoline, they'll send the occupiers on foot, and those guys definitely won't last even the 20 or 30 minutes on the front line that the CIA director mentioned. Sometimes a Russian soldier survives even less time than our foreign partners say. Every section of the front has its own situation. It's very dynamic. In any case, everything related to destruction, including enemy logistics, has a direct impact on the front. If we're talking about the south, if we're talking about Kharkiv region, about Sunni region, and of course the Donetsk front, well, all sections of the front are connected in one way or another. But in any case, the events that develop in one direction of the front can affect the intensity of fighting in another section of the front. The front is a single whole and reacts to what happens.
Thank you, Serhiy, for taking the time to join us. Serhiy Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, was with us on the line.